While Stalin demanded his allies open a second front, somewhere in the frozen forests of Europe, one American boy stood alone against a German armored column. Not a general, not a strategist, just a soldier barely old enough to vote. His name was Audie Murphy. And do you know what Stalin said about men like him? This is the story of a paradox. On one side, Joseph Stalin, ruler of a vast empire, commander of millions, a man who measured victory in rivers of blood. On the other, a single Texan farm boy, too small to be taken seriously, too poor to imagine greatness, too stubborn to quit. When history tells us about World War II, we usually picture maps with arrows, generals at conferences, and armies clashing in the millions. But sometimes, history pivots on the trigger finger of one man. January 1945. Snow drifted through the ruins of eastern France. German panzers roared across the fields, black crosses painted on their iron hides. Entire companies of American soldiers were falling back. The line was breaking. And yet, one man refused to move. Audie Murphy climbed onto a burning tank destroyer, mounted its .50 caliber machine gun, and faced an army alone. What followed became legend. But this is not just a tale of bravery, it is a story of contrasts. As Stalin berated Roosevelt and Churchill, "Open the second front now." In the mud and snow of the Western Front, young Americans like Murphy carried the burden. Stalin commanded millions. Murphy stood alone. Stalin spoke of history. Murphy made it. So here's the question we'll chase in this video. What matters more in a war, the vast armies of a dictator or the stubborn defiance of one unlikely soldier? Audie Murphy was not born a hero. He was born hungry. June 20th, 1925, Hunt County, Texas, the middle of nowhere. A family of 12 children, scraping by on tenant farming, their lives measured in backbreaking labor and empty plates. By the time Audie could walk, he could work. He carried water, picked cotton, hunted rabbits with an old rifle just to put food on the table. But poverty was not his only burden. His father drifted away, abandoning the family. His mother, frail but determined, held the children together until illness claimed her life when Audie was still a teenager. He was left with nothing but brothers and sisters who depended on him. Childhood ended early. The Great Depression carved him into someone who knew only survival. And if survival was all he had, he carried it like a weapon. Audie wasn't impressive at first glance. He stood barely 5'5", weighed less than 120 pounds, and looked years younger than his age. When war came, he tried to enlist in the Marines, rejected, too small. He tried the paratroopers, rejected again. Even the Navy turned him down. But Audie Murphy did not understand the word no. At last, in June 1942, the U.S. Army accepted him. They needed men. He would become more than that. Basic training was brutal for someone of his size, yet Audie turned weakness into fury. He ran farther, shot straighter, fought harder than anyone expected. In the barracks, comrades joked he looked like a child. On the firing range, they stopped laughing. His marksmanship was uncanny. Years of hunting rabbits in the fields of Texas had forged an instinct no drill sergeant could teach. By 1943, Murphy was in North Africa, then Sicily, then the bloody hills of Italy. The boy who couldn't get into the Marines was suddenly storming beaches and climbing mountains under fire. At Salerno, he proved fearless under artillery. At Anzio, he refused to back down when machine guns swept the fields. Medals began to pile up, but for Audie, recognition meant little. What mattered was keeping the men beside him alive. His unit noticed something strange. Murphy had a sense, a predator's sense, of danger. He could spot ambushes before they happened, read the terrain like a map, and strike with terrifying precision. In one clash near Rome, he single-handedly silenced a German machine gun nest with nothing but grenades and raw nerve. Soldiers started whispering. Maybe this boy from Texas wasn't ordinary. Maybe he was born for this. In August 1944, during the Allied invasion of southern France, Audie Murphy's legend grew. Near the village of Ramatuelle, his company was pinned down by enemy fire. Murphy crawled forward alone, seized a captured German MG-42, and raked the hillside. He killed or wounded more than 20 soldiers in minutes, turning the tide of battle. By the end of that campaign, he was no longer the kid. He was the fighter. But Murphy's rise was not without scars. He watched friends die beside him. He saw towns reduced to rubble, civilians shattered by a war they never asked for. Letters home were short, clipped. The boy who once dreamed of escape from Texas now lived with nightmares he couldn't escape in France or Italy. Still, he pressed on. When offered a chance to become an officer, he declined. He wanted to stay with the men who trusted him, the men who had bled with him. Leadership, to Murphy, wasn't about rank. It was about responsibility. And yet, destiny was pushing him toward a moment when responsibility would mean more than anyone imagined. In the frozen fields of eastern France, January 1945, Murphy would face a choice: retreat with his men or stand alone against overwhelming force. He chose to stand. But before we get there, remember who Audie Murphy was. Not a general, not a giant, not a man born with privilege or power. Just a hungry boy from Texas, too small to be accepted, too stubborn to give up. And it was that stubbornness, the refusal to bend, the refusal to quit, that transformed him into the most decorated American soldier of World War II. January 26, 1945, eastern France. The land was bitter cold, the sky low and gray, the ground locked in winter's iron grip. Snow crusted over shattered farmhouses and skeletal orchards. The Americans called this stretch of land the Colmar Pocket, the last bastion of German forces west of the Rhine, and a place where death prowled in every hedgerow. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy stood with his company near the village of Holtzwihr. They were exhausted, frostbitten, understrength, fewer than 40 men holding ground that should have required hundreds. Most were young, barely more than boys, shivering inside threadbare coats. Ammunition was low, heavy weapons scarce, and their position dangerously exposed. The morning began with silence, but not for long. Across the frozen fields came a sound every soldier feared: the grinding thunder of tank treads. German panzers, 6 of them supported by at least 2 companies of infantry, nearly 200 men. They advanced in disciplined waves, black crosses painted on armored hulls, their engines rumbling like beasts released from a cage. Murphy knew the truth. This wasn't a fair fight. His men would be slaughtered if they tried to stand. He barked an order: retreat to the tree line, take cover, survive. They obeyed, scrambling back through snow and smoke. But when they turned to see if their lieutenant followed, he was still there, alone. A disabled M10 tank destroyer sat nearby, its hull scorched, its crew long gone. Smoke curled from its interior, ammunition inside crackling and popping as the fire spread. To approach it was madness. To climb it was suicide. Murphy did both. He mounted the .50 caliber Browning machine gun fixed on top, gripped the icy handles, and pointed it at the advancing horde. The first burst thundered across the field. Heavy rounds tore into German infantry, ripping through bodies, throwing men to the ground. Soldiers dropped into ditches, tried to scatter, but the open ground betrayed them. Murphy swept the gun left to right, carving arcs of death across the snow. The Germans were stunned. From a distance, it must have looked like the tank destroyer had come back to life, spitting fire at their ranks. But they soon realized it wasn't a machine. It was one man against an army. Panzer cannons roared in response. Shells slammed into the earth around Murphy, showers of dirt and ice exploding skyward. Shrapnel cut across his face and hands. Smoke choked his lungs. The heat of the burning wreck seared through his uniform. Yet, he did not move. He kept firing. German squads tried to flank him. He swung the Browning, cut them down before they could get close. Others crawled forward, trying to use the terrain for cover. Murphy spotted them instantly, stitched the ground with fire until they vanished in smoke and blood. Minutes dragged into an eternity. The world shrank to the steel handles beneath his hands, the rattle of the machine gun, and the unending tide of enemies before him. Behind the tree line, Murphy's men watched in disbelief. They saw their lieutenant silhouetted against the flames, standing atop the wreck like some avenging figure, bullets and shells exploding all around him. Every instinct screamed that he was doomed, yet somehow he endured. One soldier whispered, "He's buying us time." Another answered, "He's saving all of us." The Germans pressed harder. A group of infantry rushed from the right, shouting, firing as they advanced. Murphy pivoted, unleashed a storm of rounds, and cut them down to the last man. A panzer turned its cannon directly on him and fired. The shell struck the ground just short of the wreck, blasting dirt across the field, nearly throwing Murphy from his perch. He staggered, blood running down his leg where shrapnel tore into him. For a moment, it looked like he might fall. But he climbed back up, gritted his teeth, and pulled the trigger again. For almost an hour, he held that line, alone. Estimates vary, but records suggest Murphy killed or wounded more than 200 German soldiers during that single stand. 200 men, held back by one boy from Texas. His bullets chewed through entire squads. His Defiance halted an armored advance that should have crushed the company. At last, the panzers began to withdraw. Smoke trailed from their turrets. Their infantry lay scattered across the field, unwilling to push any further. The German assault had shattered, not against an army, not against artillery, but against one man's refusal to break. And still, Murphy was not finished. When the last of the attackers fell back, he climbed down from the burning wreck, bleeding, exhausted, half-deaf from the gunfire. Any other man would have collapsed. Instead, Murphy limped to his men, reorganized them, and led a counterattack. They pushed the Germans back, reclaimed the ground, and held the village. When it was over, the field lay silent except for the hiss of smoke and the distant groans of the wounded. Snow was stained black and red. Around the burnt-out husk of the tank destroyer, the earth was littered with bodies, evidence of one man's stand. Murphy's superiors could scarcely believe the reports. One soldier, wounded and alone, had delayed an entire German assault. For his actions that day, he would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration of the United States. But the medal could not capture the reality, the fear he felt, the pain he endured, the sheer willpower that kept him on that burning wreck when every rational thought told him to run. Later, when journalists asked why he hadn't retreated, Murphy answered simply, "They were killing my friends." That was the heart of it, not glory, not medals, not the history books. For Murphy, it was always about the men beside him, the brothers he refused to abandon. By the end of World War II, Audie Murphy had received every major U.S. combat award for valor, plus honors from France and Belgium. He was the most decorated American soldier of the entire war. Yet no ribbon or star could ever outshine the image of that day, January 26, 1945, when one man stood against an army and did not fall. While Audie Murphy was fighting for his life on the frozen fields of France, another man sat thousands of miles away in a fortress of stone. Joseph Stalin, the generalissimo, the ruler of the Soviet Union. A man who held not just battalions, but nations in his fist. To Stalin, war was not measured in single soldiers or even companies. It was measured in millions. The Red Army had swallowed entire armies of the Wehrmacht, fought them village by village, factory by factory, across the endless plains of Russia. At Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers had clawed their way through rubble and smoke to break the German Sixth Army. At Kursk, they had unleashed a storm of steel that shattered Hitler's last great offensive in the East. By 1945, the Soviets had endured losses on a scale the West could barely imagine, more than 20 million dead. To Stalin, sacrifice was a currency he spent freely. And yet, he never stopped demanding more. For years, Stalin pressed Roosevelt and Churchill with a single question: when will you open the second front? The Soviet Union had carried the heaviest burden of the war, bleeding day after day against the Wehrmacht. Stalin believed, not without reason, that his allies were stalling, letting Soviet soldiers absorb the punishment while American factories and British fleets grew stronger. At Tehran, at Yalta, in telegram after telegram, Stalin hammered the point home. Open the front in France, draw the Germans away from Russia. His words were iron, his tone unyielding. To him, history was written in grand strategy, in the movements of millions, in the clash of entire continents. But history is never just strategy. Sometimes it comes down to a boy with a rifle. This is the paradox of World War II. While Stalin spoke in the language of empires, Audie Murphy spoke in the language of survival. On January 26, 1945, the very day Murphy turned a burning tank destroyer into a fortress, the Soviets were pressing their own offensive. Operation Vistula Oder had hurled Soviet armies deep into Poland, pushing relentlessly toward Berlin. It was a campaign of staggering scale. Armies counted not in thousands, but in millions. The Red Army rolled forward with tanks, artillery, entire air fleets. Their advance shook the earth. And yet, what held the Western Front in France that same week was not a million-man army. It was one soldier. Imagine the irony. In Moscow, Stalin berated his allies for delay, for weakness, for cowardice. In the forests of France, an undersized Texan stood against panzers with nothing but a .50 caliber machine gun. Stalin saw only numbers. Murphy proved that numbers could lie. For if the German assault at Holtzwihr had succeeded, if Murphy had fallen or fled, the breakthrough could have cost the Allies dearly. Supply lines shattered, towns retaken, momentum stalled. War is a chain of events, and sometimes the weakest link decides everything. One collapse in France might have changed the timetable for the march into Germany. One delay could have given Hitler precious weeks to fortify Berlin, to prolong the bloodshed. Stalin never knew Murphy's name. To him, American soldiers were abstractions, faceless pieces on a global chessboard. Yet the irony is unavoidable. Stalin demanded armies, but it was an army of one that made the difference on that winter morning. So what does this tell us about power? Stalin believed power was scale, divisions, factories, nations mobilized. Murphy's story suggests another truth. Power can be condensed into a single moment of refusal. A boy raised in poverty, turned away by the Marines, dismissed by officers as too small, had become the hinge on which a battle, perhaps even a campaign, turned. Of course, perspective matters. The Soviet Union bore losses America could scarcely comprehend. Without the sacrifice of millions of Soviet soldiers, Hitler's Reich might never have crumbled. It would be dishonest to suggest that one Texan outweighed the entire Eastern Front, but it is equally dishonest to forget that wars are not won by abstractions alone. They are won by individuals who, when the moment comes, do not break. That is where Stalin and Murphy intersect. Stalin's empire demanded sacrifice. Murphy embodied it. Stalin saw men as expendable. Murphy proved that a single man could be indispensable. Stalin moved pieces across a map. Murphy showed that sometimes the smallest piece can stop the game entirely. And so we return to the central question. What matters more in war? The millions sacrificed by a dictator or the one soldier who refuses to give ground? Perhaps the truth lies in the tension between them. The Soviet Union broke the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, but individual acts like Murphy's ensured the Western Front did not collapse. The Red Army's waves of men and tanks pushed toward Berlin, but in France, a single burning tank destroyer became a fortress because one soldier climbed onto it. Stalin's shadow stretched across Europe. But on that snowy field near Holtzwihr, the shadow was pierced by fire from a Browning machine gun. And here's the irony that history often hides. Stalin may have seen himself as the master of destiny, the architect of victory. Yet destiny, in that moment, was written not in the Kremlin, but in the frozen blood of one American boy. The war did not end with Audie Murphy's machine gun fire in Holtzwihr. It raged on for months through ruined cities and across rivers turned red. Stalin's armies thundered into Berlin. The stars and stripes rose over shattered fortresses in the west. Hitler's Reich collapsed in fire and rubble. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world tried to count its losses. Numbers were staggering, almost incomprehensible. Tens of millions dead, whole nations scarred forever. Stalin proclaimed victory for the Soviet people, pointing to the rivers of blood they had spilled. American generals spoke of industry, logistics, strategy. But behind every speech, every parade, there were the faces of men who had carried the war on their shoulders. Audie Murphy was one of them, a farm boy from Texas, too small for the Marines, too ordinary for destiny, until destiny chose him. He survived the war, but he did not escape it. The medals on his chest could not silence the nightmares. The world called him a hero. He called himself a survivor. And yet his story endures because it reminds us of a truth too often forgotten. Wars are not won only by dictators in palaces or generals with maps. They are won by the ordinary who do the extraordinary, by men who refuse to run when running would be easy, by voices drowned in history, except for the moments when their defiance changes everything. So here's the question to leave you with. If Stalin had ever met Audie Murphy, what would he have said? Would he have called him a hero or dismissed him as just another pawn in the grand machinery of war? The answer may never be known, but perhaps that is the lesson. Stalin's shadow was vast, yet even the largest shadow can be pierced by the smallest flame. Audie Murphy was that flame, and sometimes in the darkest winters of history, one flame is enough.